He began to remember things he didn't know he had forgotten. His childhood dreams, the songs his mother used to hum, the way he once believed the world was magic. He started drawing again, something he hadn't done in decades. Not to impress anyone, but because it made him feel alive. He began to pray, not to a God who sat in judgment, but to the quiet part of himself that had waited so long to be heard. And one morning, as he stood barefoot in the dew-covered grass, the mountains glowing pink in the early light, he whispered the words he had never dared to say aloud. I am enough. Not because he had done something great, not because someone else had said so, but because he had finally come home to himself, to the truth that was never gone, only buried beneath layers of noise and fear. The monk smiled when he told him, not with surprise, but with the quiet joy of one who had been waiting. Now, he said, you can begin. The days in the village became his teacher. No loud proclamations, no divine revelations, just the quiet repetition of simplicity, the kind of life that didn't demand attention, but gently pulled you back into awareness. There was something sacred in the way things unfolded there. Soft, rhythmic, without need for grandeur. He began to see how deeply he had misunderstood peace. It wasn't a reward for a life perfected. It was the result of surrendering into what already was. The monk never spoke of enlightenment as a destination. In fact, he rarely spoke of it at all. Instead, he lived in a way that made every moment feel like a whisper from the eternal. He swept the temple steps as though he were brushing dust from the edge of the universe. He brewed tea with the attention of someone tending to the soul of water itself. He listened, truly listened, not only to words, but to the spaces between them. And the man watched, absorbed, learned, not through lessons, but through presence. One morning, the monk handed him a small wooden bowl and a bundle of incense. Today, he said, you walk alone. The man nodded, though a flicker of hesitation rose in his chest. He had grown accustomed to the comfort of the monk's quiet company, the steady rhythm of their shared walks. But something within him knew it was time, not to move on, but to move deeper. He tucked the incense into his coat and began his walk toward the hills. The path was steep in places, overgrown in others. Birds moved through the trees like brushstrokes on the canvas of morning. He could hear his breath now, not as a background rhythm, but as a companion. Each step became a small act of prayer. Each pause a reminder to stay, to feel, to notice. At the crest of the hill, he found a flat clearing surrounded by tall grasses and a single solitary tree. It wasn't majestic. It was weathered, slightly bent, with bark cracked and rough like aged hands. But it stood, unapologetically, without need for perfection. And somehow, that tree spoke to something deep inside him. He knelt beneath it, placed the bowl in front of him, and lit the incense. The smoke rose slowly, curling into the sky like memory. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush his face, and he sat. No mantra, no guidance, just presence. For the first few minutes, thoughts crowded in like they always did. Doubts, lists, old fears. He didn't resist them. He let them come, let them swirl, let them pass. He remembered the monk's words. Your thoughts are clouds. You are the sky. And slowly the thoughts began to drift, giving way to stillness. Not an empty stillness, but a full one. The kind that hums, the kind that listens back. He began to feel the weight he had carried, some of it for years, start to dissolve. Not all at once, not with drama, but gently, like ice melting beneath spring's first sun. He saw the faces of people he had hurt and those who had hurt him, and for the first time he didn't flinch. He didn't justify or blame. He simply held them in his heart and whispered, I forgive you. And to himself, with eyes wet and open, I forgive you too. He sat for hours. The incense burned low. The wind shifted. Clouds moved above, casting changing shadows on the ground. And he remained there still, whole, without needing to prove or perform or earn anything. And in that sacred solitude, something ancient stirred inside him. Not an answer, but a memory. A remembering that he had never been separate, that the breath of the world was his own, that every tree, every bird, every moment of stillness was an invitation to come home. When he returned to the village as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the monk was waiting by the temple gate, his eyes soft, knowing. "I didn't find anything," the man said quietly. The monk smiled. "Exactly." That night, they shared tea in silence, the fire crackling low beside them. And in that silence, the man felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not joy, not even peace, but something purer. He began to remember things he didn't know he had forgotten. His childhood dreams, the songs his mother used to hum, the way he once believed the world was magic. He started drawing again, something he hadn't done in decades, not to impress anyone, but because it made him feel alive. He began to pray, not to a God who sat in judgment, but to the quiet part of himself that had waited so long to be heard. And one morning, as he stood barefoot in the dew-covered grass, the mountains glowing pink in the early light, he whispered the words he had never dared to say aloud. "I am enough." Not because he had done something great, not because someone else had said so, but because he had finally come home to himself, to the truth that was never gone, only buried beneath layers of noise and fear. The monk smiled when he told him, not with surprise, but with the quiet joy of one who had been waiting. "Now," he said, "you can begin." The days in the village became his teacher. No loud proclamations, no divine revelations, just the quiet repetition of simplicity, the kind of life that didn't demand attention, but gently pulled you back into awareness. There was something sacred in the way things unfolded there, soft, rhythmic, without need for grandeur. He began to see how deeply he had misunderstood peace. It wasn't a reward for a life perfected. It was the result of surrendering into what already was. The monk never spoke of enlightenment as a destination. In fact, he rarely spoke of it at all. Instead, he lived in a way that made every moment feel like a whisper from the eternal. He swept the temple steps as though he were brushing dust from the edge of the universe. He brewed tea with the attention of someone tending to the soul of water itself. He listened, truly listened, not only to words, but to the spaces between them. And the man watched, absorbed, learned, not through lessons, but through presence. One morning, the monk handed him a small wooden bowl and a bundle of incense. "Today," he said, "you walk alone." The man nodded, though a flicker of hesitation rose in his chest. He had grown accustomed to the comfort of the monk's quiet company, the steady rhythm of their shared walks. But something within him knew it was time, not to move on, but to move deeper. He tucked the incense into his coat and began his walk toward the hills. The path was steep in places, overgrown in others. Birds moved through the trees like brushstrokes on the canvas of morning. He could hear his breath now, not as a background rhythm, but as a companion. Each step became a small act of prayer. Each pause a reminder to stay, to feel, to notice. At the crest of the hill, he found a flat clearing surrounded by tall grasses and a single solitary tree. It wasn't majestic. It was weathered, slightly bent, with bark cracked and rough like aged hands. But it stood, unapologetically, without need for perfection. And somehow, that tree spoke to something deep inside him. He knelt beneath it, placed the bowl in front of him, and lit the incense. The smoke rose slowly, curling into the sky like memory. He closed his eyes, letting the wind brush his face, and he sat. No mantra, no guidance, just presence. For the first few minutes, thoughts crowded in like they always did. Doubts, lists, old fears. He didn't resist them. He let them come, let them swirl, let them pass. He remembered the monk's words. "Your thoughts are clouds. You are the sky." And slowly the thoughts began to drift, giving way to stillness. Not an empty stillness, but a full one. The kind that hums, the kind that listens back. He began to feel the weight he had carried, some of it for years, start to dissolve. Not all at once, not with drama, but gently, like ice melting beneath spring's first sun. He saw the faces of people he had hurt and those who had hurt him, and for the first time he didn't flinch. He didn't justify or blame. He simply held them in his heart and whispered, "I forgive you." And to himself, with eyes wet and open, "I forgive you too." He sat for hours. The incense burned low. The wind shifted. Clouds moved above, casting changing shadows on the ground. And he remained there still, whole, without needing to prove or perform or earn anything. And in that sacred solitude, something ancient stirred inside him. Not an answer, but a memory. A remembering that he had never been separate, that the breath of the world was his own, that every tree, every bird, every moment of stillness was an invitation to come home. When he returned to the village as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the monk was waiting by the temple gate, his eyes soft, knowing. "I didn't find anything," the man said quietly. The monk smiled. "Exactly." That night, they shared tea in silence, the fire crackling low beside them. And in that silence, the man felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement, not joy, not even peace, but something purer, clarity. The fog that had once clouded his heart had begun to lift. Not because the world had changed, but because he had stopped resisting it, because he had chosen again and again to stay. In the following days, he continued his walks alone, not to escape, but to explore the stillness within. He noticed how often his mind tried to pull him back into old patterns, into needing to be someone, needing to be doing something. But each time he caught it, smiled, released it, and returned, again and again, to the breath, to the present, to the truth that lived not in some distant future, but right here, in the way the light filtered through the trees, in the way his footsteps echoed softly on the path, in the way his chest rose and fell like the sea. One evening, he asked the monk, "How do I take this with me when I return?" The monk looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You don't take it," he said. "You become it." The words landed in his heart like seeds, not loud, not dramatic, but deep. He had come here searching, hoping to fill the void, to become better, more centered, more whole. But what he had found was something simpler, more profound, that he was never broken. That presence doesn't need to be achieved. It only needs to be remembered. And the more he remembered, the more he softened. The more he softened, the more he awakened. And now the awakening had become its own rhythm. Not a single event, but a quiet unfolding. A return not to something new, but to something forgotten, something timeless, something true. The next morning arrived without announcement, just like all the others. The rooster crowed softly in the distance, and the smell of damp earth drifted through the window as the first light touched the room. He opened his eyes slowly, not because he had somewhere to be, but because the world was waking and he wanted to meet it without hesitation. His body moved gently now, not rushed or restless. He had learned the value of small things, how stretching before sunrise, washing his face with cold water, or folding his blanket could become rituals of devotion. There was a time when he measured life by how much he could achieve in a day. Tasks completed, goals accomplished, productivity tracked. But here, in the simplicity of this village, he began to measure life differently. How often did he breathe consciously today? How deeply did he listen? Did he notice the birds in the trees? Did he let go when his mind pulled him toward the past? These now were the markers of his day. As he stepped out into the morning air, the temple bell rang, low and resonant. It didn't signal urgency, only awareness, the present moment ringing itself awake. He found himself drawn once more toward the forest's edge, where the moss was thick and the trees seemed older than memory. Walking that path had become a kind of sacred rhythm, his bare feet pressing into the damp soil, each step a gentle affirmation that he was here, still becoming. He reached a small clearing where the earth opened to the sky. There he sat cross-legged and closed his eyes, not to meditate, not to seek, but to simply exist, to feel the breeze move through his hair, to hear the whisper of leaves dancing with wind, to let the silence hold him like an old friend. And in that space, he let himself ask the question he had been carrying for years. Why did I leave the life I built? And the answer rose not from his mind, but from something deeper, a truth he hadn't dared to face. He left not because he hated that life, but because it had begun to erase him. The constant need to be everything for everyone. The long hours filled with noise, with expectations, with endless striving to prove that he mattered. He had poured himself into roles, into titles, into identities, until there was nothing left but the shell of someone who used to dream. And now, sitting under this sky, he no longer needed to run from that truth. He had grieved the parts of himself that had been neglected. He had wept for the dreams he had abandoned, but he no longer carried the weight of regret, because he saw now that those years, though painful, were not wasted. They brought him here, to this moment, to this breath, to this remembering. He picked up a fallen leaf beside him, its edges curled and browned. Once it had been green, vibrant, part of something larger. Now it was separate, fading, yet beautiful. Its purpose not diminished by its changing form, but fulfilled through it. He held the leaf in his palm and whispered, "Thank you." And in that small act, he honored every version of himself, the one who tried, who failed, who loved imperfectly, who never gave up. When he returned to the village that evening, he noticed something different. The way the villagers greeted him had changed. Their nods were deeper, their smiles more knowing. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't tried to be anyone. But something in his presence was clearer now, more rooted. And the world, as it often does, mirrored that change. The monk noticed it too. They sat together by the fire, sipping tea as the night deepened. "You're quieter now," the monk said softly. Not as a question, but as a gentle observation. "I don't need to explain everything anymore," the man replied. The monk nodded. When the heart understands, the mind doesn't need to speak so much. That night, lying beneath the blanket of stars outside the temple, the man thought of all the things he had once believed he needed in order to be whole. Status, validation, constant affirmation. But here he was, without any of them, and yet more whole than ever. He didn't feel powerful, he felt present, and that presence was enough. In the days that followed, he began to help more around the village. He worked in the gardens, turning soil with his hands, planting seeds with care. He chopped wood, not as labor, but as a gift. He shared meals with the elders, laughing at stories that didn't need punchlines. And each night, he sat by the fire, letting the flames remind him that everything changes, everything burns, everything becomes something else, and yet nothing is lost. The children began to follow him during his walks, curious about his quiet, drawn to the gentleness he now carried like a second skin. One day, a little girl handed him a smooth stone and said, "It's for when you feel lonely." He didn't correct her. He just smiled and tucked it into his pocket. Because even now, even after all the quiet, there were still moments of loneliness. But he no longer feared them. He sat with them, listened to them, let them teach him. The monk once said, "Loneliness is not the absence of people, it's the absence of connection with yourself." And slowly, through stillness, through silence, through surrender, the man had reconnected, not just with himself, but with life. And life, he had discovered, wasn't something to conquer, it was something to bow to. It rained one morning, soft, unhurried, the kind of rain that doesn't rush to leave, but lingers like a lullaby. He watched it fall from the temple's wooden veranda, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The raindrops tapped rhythmically against the old roof, slid down the carved beams, and pulled gently in the crevices of the stone path. The world outside was painted in grays and greens, and in that still, muted palette, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't known he was missing. Rain had become one of his teachers, not in words but in presence. It didn't ask for permission, it didn't apologize, it simply arrived. It softened what was hard, cleansed what was hidden, gave without needing to be understood. And so he sat, listening, not just to the rain, but to what it stirred in him, the quiet griefs, the forgotten hopes, the places inside him still learning how to be gentle. He thought about all the times he had resisted change, held on too tightly to what needed to fall away, how he had once believed that strength was about holding it all together. But now, watching the rain wash the earth clean, he saw clearly. Strength wasn't in holding on. It was in releasing, in trusting the fall, in allowing life to move through you without always needing to control it. Later that afternoon, when the rain had quieted to a mist, he walked through the garden barefoot. The earth was soft, the scent of wet leaves and stone rising around him like incense. He crouched beside a small patch of flowers blooming against the wall, their colors vivid against the gray sky. He had seen them before, but hadn't noticed them fully. Today they held his gaze. It amazed him how much beauty had been waiting for him to slow down, how much life he had missed because he was always running toward the next thing. In his old life, he would have seen these flowers and labeled them, cataloged them in his mind, maybe even taken a picture. But now he simply knelt before them, not to own, not to define, but to witness. He reached out and touched a petal. It bent beneath his fingertip, then sprang back, resilient and alive. And in that moment, he felt a quiet echo in his own heart. He too had bent, under pressure, under pain, under the weight of expectations, but he had not broken. He was still here, breathing, becoming. That night, as he sat with the monk by the fire once more, the wind carrying the scent of pine through the open window, he asked, "Do you ever miss your old life?" The monk stirred the embers gently before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "but not because I want to return. I miss the parts of me I didn't know how to love back then." The words sat between them like a soft light. The man felt them settle deep into his chest. He knew what the monk meant. There were versions of himself, hurried, afraid, desperate to be seen, that he had spent years trying to forget. But now he could see them differently. Not as failures, but as stepping stones. As voices calling out from the dark, asking for kindness. "I think I'm ready to go back soon," the man said. The monk didn't react. He just nodded once, slowly, and said, "Then carry this with you." Not as a memory, as a way of being. The days that followed were quiet, a sacred kind of preparation, though no one spoke of it. He began to revisit the places he had come to love, the stream where he first found stillness, the hilltop where he sat with incense and released his old burdens, the bench beneath the Bodhi tree where silence had taught him more than any words. Each visit was a goodbye, but not a departure, more like a bow of gratitude, a whisper to the earth that had held him while he remembered himself. On his final morning in the village, he woke before the sun. The sky was still draped in blue shadow, and a faint hush stretched across the land. He walked to the edge of the forest one last time and sat on the same stone where he had once questioned everything. The questions were still there, but they no longer haunted him. He had learned to hold them like birds, lightly, gently, without needing them to land. When the first light broke through the trees, he stood, closed his eyes, and placed his hand over his heart. He didn't speak. He didn't pray. He simply stood there, breathing, letting the moment mark him. Back at the temple, the monks stood waiting by the gate. They didn't embrace. They didn't speak of farewells. Only silence passed between them. But in that silence was everything. Gratitude, respect, love. The kind of love that doesn't cling, the kind that blesses you as you go. You'll forget, the monk said finally, but then you'll remember. The man smiled, tears brimming, but not falling. And if I get lost? The monk's eyes shone with gentleness. Then you'll sit and breathe and find your way home again. With that, the man turned toward the path that would lead him back, not to the life he had left behind, but to the life he was now ready to live. A life still filled with chaos and noise and imperfection, but one he could now meet with presence. Because awakening, he had discovered, wasn't about escaping the world. It was about returning to it with new eyes, a quieter heart, and the unwavering trust that he no longer needed to be anyone but himself. The road back was quiet, not in sound, but in energy. He walked through landscapes familiar and unfamiliar all at once. Trees no longer seemed like obstacles on the side of the path. They were companions. The wind wasn't just a force against his face, it was a conversation. The sky above him didn't feel distant anymore. It felt like home. Each step he took was not a return to the old, but an entry into a life renewed, not because the world had changed, but because he had. By the time he reached the outskirts of the city, a strange sensation rose within him. Not fear, not anxiety, but something softer, an ache maybe, a gentle hum in his chest that reminded him how much he had shed. He stood there for a while watching the traffic move, the lights flash, the people pass by with hurried footsteps and heavy eyes. And he didn't judge them. He understood. He had once been one of them, caught in the current, convinced that movement was meaning. He re-entered his apartment, untouched, quiet, as though it had been holding its breath in his absence. Everything was just as he had left it, but he was not. The stillness of the space echoed against the changes inside him. He stood in the center of the room listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant city noise, the subtle tick of a forgotten clock. Then he sat on the floor, just like he had learned to do, closed his eyes and returned to his breath. It wasn't long before the weight of the world crept back in. Emails began to pour in. Notifications blinked like tiny demands. People asked questions. Some were curious. Others were confused. A few were annoyed. Where did you go? Why didn't you say anything? Are you okay? He responded gently when he needed to, but mostly he didn't try to explain. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew some journeys can't be translated. Some awakenings are too quiet to be understood by those still caught in the noise. He went to his old favorite cafe, sat by the window where he used to lose himself in work and deadlines. But this time he sipped his coffee slowly, noticing its warmth, the texture, the way the light danced on the rim of the cup. The city hadn't changed, but his way of seeing it had. He saw kindness in the tired barista's eyes. He saw longing in the couple at the corner table, talking past each other. He saw beauty in the cracks of the sidewalk, in the way people carried their burdens without complaint. One evening, a friend visited, someone from his before. The friend looked around the apartment, then at him, puzzled. "You seem different," they said. "Like you're here, but somewhere else at the same time." He smiled. "Maybe I'm just here, finally." The friend frowned, not understanding. And that was okay. He didn't expect them to. He no longer needed everyone to see him the way he now saw himself. That had been the old wound, constantly proving his worth, seeking to be validated by others' reflections. Now he had become his own mirror, and what he saw there was enough. He kept some routines but changed their rhythm. Morning coffee became a meditation. Washing dishes became a practice in presence. Even the chaos of the city became a classroom. Each honk, each impatient glance, a reminder to return to the breath, to pause, to soften. One morning while walking to the market, he passed a young man sitting on the curb, head down, eyes heavy. He paused, unsure why. Then instinctively, he sat beside him, not to offer advice, not to rescue, just to be there. They sat in silence for a long time. Eventually, the young man looked up, confused. "Why are you sitting here?" "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe because I've been there too." The young man didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. That moment stayed with him. It reminded him that awakening wasn't about rising above others. It was about sitting beside them, not offering light from a distance, but being the warmth someone could lean into when the world felt cold. He began volunteering at a local shelter, not because he needed to be useful, but because presence, he had come to understand, was meant to be shared. He didn't talk much. He listened. He folded blankets, served meals, shared silence with strangers who reminded him of his former self. People holding pain in their bones, waiting for someone to simply say, "I see you." At night, he often sat by his window, looking out at the city lights flickering like a million unanswered prayers. And he whispered blessings, not grand or poetic, just simple words sent into the night. "May you be safe. May you be free from pain. May you remember who you are beneath all the noise." Sometimes he wrote letters he'd never send, to old friends, to people who had hurt him, to the parts of himself he had once abandoned. The writing wasn't for closure, it was for clarity, for healing, for release. He still had bad days, days when the noise returned, when the old doubts whispered again. But now he didn't run, he didn't numb. He sat, he breathed. He watched the storm inside pass, just like he had watched the clouds over the mountain temple. He had learned that peace isn't the absence of struggle, it's the presence of acceptance. And in that acceptance, he found something more powerful than certainty. He found wholeness. The seasons began to shift again, as they always do. The air grew cooler, and the trees shed their gold and crimson coats like the gentle exhale of a world that knows how to let go. And he too was changing again, not in grand gestures or sweeping transformations, but in the subtle way his breath moved through him, slower now, more rooted. His days flowed like a stream, unforced, honest. He no longer searched for meaning in every shadow. He had found something quieter, peace with not knowing. One morning, while walking through the park, he passed a child sitting beneath a tree, drawing on a piece of cardboard. She looked up as he walked by and asked, "Are you a monk?" The question made him smile, not because he was, but because something in her saw what he was still learning to see in himself. He knelt beside her and said, "No, just someone who forgot how to be quiet for a while." She looked at him, thoughtful. "But you're quiet now." He nodded. "Because someone once sat with me while I remembered." She offered him her drawing, a tree with roots as large as its branches. "It's strong," she said. He held the drawing carefully as though it were sacred. "Yes, it is." The moment stayed with him for days. That child's simplicity, her vision, the way she saw what most adults had long forgotten. We are not meant to live just on the surface. Our roots matter. The parts of us no one sees. The fears we've faced, the silence we've sat in, the love we've lost and learned from. They shape us. And when we honor them, we grow strong. Not in a way that dominates, but in a way that endures. Back at home, he framed the drawing and placed it on his small altar. Not beside a statue, not under a candle, but in the center. A reminder that strength comes from presence, from stillness, from rootedness. He no longer meditated to reach somewhere. He meditated to remember, to return. Each breath a thread weaving him back into the fabric of life. He no longer asked, "What am I becoming?" but instead, "What am I being right now?" It was enough, this breath, this moment, this aliveness. One evening he visited the river that curved quietly through the outskirts of the city. It had always been there, flowing past unnoticed, but now it felt like an old friend. He sat on a worn stone and watched the water pass, carrying leaves, light, reflections. The river wasn't in a hurry, it didn't hold on, it didn't demand, it just flowed. And that's what he had become. Not stagnant, not frozen, but fluid, awake. A man sat next to him, a stranger. They exchanged no greetings, just silence. Eventually the man asked, "Do you come here often?" He smiled. "Only when I need to remember how to move without force." The man nodded. "I used to think life was about climbing. Now I just want to sit beside things that don't need to be climbed." They sat until the sky dimmed. When they parted, it wasn't with names or numbers, but with a shared sense that something important had happened. A connection, unspoken, but real. And that, he realized, was enough. You don't need to be known to be seen. Sometimes presence is the greatest offering. Over time, more people began to notice the quiet way he lived. They asked him questions, sought his advice, wanted his clarity. But he didn't call himself a teacher. He called himself a listener. He didn't try to guide with answers, but with space. A space where others could hear themselves more clearly. A space where stillness spoke louder than instruction. He began holding circles, small, intimate gatherings where people came not to be fixed, but to feel. They sat in silence. They shared stories. They cried. They laughed. They remembered. And in that remembering, they healed. Not because he healed them, but because they were given the room to heal themselves. One night, after a particularly quiet circle, someone asked him, "How did you get here?" He paused, looked out the window, and replied, "I stopped pretending I wasn't already here." And that was the truth. There was no destination, no secret map, just the courage to sit with himself long enough to see that everything he had been looking for had been waiting within him all along, covered by noise, by fear, by the belief that he had to become more before he could rest. But rest, he had learned, was not the reward. It was the way. Years later, when people told his story, they said he was a man who walked away from the world and came back to change it. But he never saw it that way. He hadn't walked away. He had walked inward. And what he brought back wasn't change, it was remembrance. Remembrance that we are already whole, that silence is not emptiness, that presence is power, that life isn't about achieving more, but becoming less, less distracted, less divided, less afraid to be seen as we are. On the last night of autumn, he returned to the mountain village where it all began. The air was crisp, the stars fierce and unshy. The temple stood just as he remembered it, humble, eternal. He sat on the old bench beneath the tree, closed his eyes, and breathed. The monk appeared beside him, as if summoned by memory alone. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They sat as they once had, hearts aligned in the shared silence of those who understand. After a long while, the monk finally said, "You've brought the mountain with you." He opened his eyes and smiled. "And the river, and the rain, and every breath since." They bowed to each other, not as student and teacher, but as two souls who had chosen the same path. The path of return, the path of awakening. And as he walked back down the mountain, lantern in hand, the light wasn't ahead of him. It was within, always had been. It was just before dawn when he awoke, not because of an alarm or a noise, but because something within him had stirred. The kind of stirring that doesn't come from restlessness, but from a deeper call. The room was silent, cloaked in the soft stillness that arrives only before the world has fully remembered itself. He sat up slowly, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. It had been many days since he had first come to this place, this quiet retreat far from the buzz of the life he once knew. And yet, each morning still felt like the first. The wooden floor was cool beneath his feet. The air held the faint scent of cedar and earth. He wrapped himself in a shawl, opened the door gently, and stepped outside. The sky was still a deep shade of indigo, with stars blinking faintly in retreat. In the distance, the first birds were beginning their chorus, timid, cautious, as though they too were just waking to what the day might bring. He walked slowly down the stone path, each step deliberate, each breath slow and steady, as if the world had slowed just enough for him to keep pace with his own soul. He reached the small shrine near the edge of the woods. A simple place, just a wooden bench, a candle, and a bell. But over the weeks, it had become something sacred, a space where he met himself, where the silence wrapped around him like an old friend, where the stories he used to tell himself began to soften, then unravel. Here he could hear the sound beneath the silence, the truth beneath the noise. He sat on the bench and closed his eyes. No mantra, no goal, just breathe. In, outside, in, outside, in, outside. He had learned slowly and painfully that meditation was not about escaping his thoughts. It was about meeting them, about watching them without judgment, about allowing them to rise and fall like waves on a shore that no longer needed to resist the tide. And on this morning, something was different. The silence didn't just hold him, it spoke, not in words, but in memory. It began with a single image, himself many years ago, standing at a crossroads. Young, ambitious, hungry for purpose. He saw the version of himself who had once believed that meaning came from success, from being admired, from constantly doing more. That young man had been brave, determined, but also afraid of failure, afraid of stillness, afraid that if he stopped moving, the world would forget him, that he would forget himself. He had followed that path for years, built a life out of effort, achievement, and carefully crafted identity. On the outside, it looked like success. On the inside, something was unraveling, slowly, quietly. The small moments he ignored, the breath he never caught, the truth he pushed down, deeper and deeper, hoping it would stay silent forever. But truth has a voice of its own. And when it's time, it doesn't scream, it whispers. And when the whisper became too loud to ignore, he left. He didn't call it running, at least not anymore. It was remembering. He remembered that he used to smile without needing a reason, that he once felt wonder in the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, that there was a time long ago when he felt connected to something greater, not because he understood it, but because he didn't try to. And so he came here, to this retreat, to this place of quiet, to learn how to listen again. The memories kept coming, not as regrets, but as reflections. He saw the moments when he had chosen image over intimacy, when he had silenced his heart in order to meet expectations, when he had told himself he was fine, even as something inside was breaking. But he didn't turn away. He didn't try to push them down again. He watched them, held them, let them pass through like wind through an open field. The candle on the shrine flickered, and he opened his eyes. Dawn had begun to break. The sky now held the soft blush of morning, and the trees were outlined in gentle light. He stood slowly, his body warmed by the stillness, his mind clearer than it had been in years. He rang the small bell once, a single note that carried through the air like a blessing, not to mark an ending, but a beginning. Back in the meditation hall, the others were beginning to gather. Faces soft with sleep, eyes still carrying the dream state. They moved with intention, with reverence, each one on their own journey, each one carrying invisible burdens, silent questions. They didn't speak much, and that was the beauty of it. In a world addicted to noise, this place was a sanctuary of unspoken understanding. They sat in a circle, cross-legged on cushions, the scent of sandalwood gently curling through the air. The teacher entered, bowed, and sat with them. No grand entrance, no performance, just presence. And in that presence, the room transformed. They began to breathe together, not in unison, but in awareness, in shared stillness, in the quiet agreement that they were all here to remember something they had forgotten. After the meditation, the teacher spoke. His voice was soft but steady, like a stream flowing through the forest. When you stop chasing who you think you should be, he said, you begin to remember who you already are. The words landed like seeds in his heart, not just inspiring, true. He looked around at the faces near him. Some had tears in their eyes, some looked inward, some smiled without knowing why. And in that circle, he realized something. None of them were here to become better versions of themselves. They were here to become whole, to remember, to return. Later that day, he walked through the woods again, this time with no destination. The sun filtered through the trees in dappled gold, and the path curved gently beneath his feet. He paused beside a fallen tree and sat, letting the earth support him. A single bird sang overhead, and he listened, not just to the song, but to the silence between the notes. It reminded him of something the teacher had once said. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's the space where truth lives. And now in that space, he found himself. Not the self he had tried to build, but the self that had always been waiting, patient, kind, unafraid of the dark. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled. Not because he had arrived, but because he had begun. The days began to weave together, not because they were indistinguishable, but because they each carried the same sacred rhythm. Wake, breathe, listen, walk, sit, rest. There was something healing in the simplicity. There are moments in life when everything around us moves so quickly, it begins to feel like we're no longer living, but simply reacting. Days bleed into nights, weeks vanish into months, and before we realize it, we're far from where we thought we'd be. We carry the weight of expectations, the noise of the world pressing against our inner quiet, and the subtle ache of forgetting who we are. Sometimes we don't even notice that we've lost ourselves in the rush, until something inside us breaks the silence and whispers, "Come back." This is where his story begins. Not with triumph, not with revelation, but with exhaustion. A man who had been many things to many people: a son, a father, a colleague, a leader, a seeker. He had spent his life trying to do everything right, trying to please, to succeed, to be seen as good, strong, capable. But no matter how much he gave, the feeling of incompleteness never left him. He thought maybe he needed to try harder, to be better, to earn something he couldn't name. But all his striving led him to a place he hadn't anticipated: silence. A silence so vast it became impossible to ignore. The silence of a soul begging to be heard. He didn't plan to leave his life behind. It wasn't a dramatic exit, no tearful goodbyes or packed bags in the night. It was more like a quiet slipping away. One day he didn't open his laptop. The next he ignored the messages. Then he started walking. Not to escape, but to breathe. To find a rhythm that wasn't dictated by alarms and meetings, but by something ancient and forgotten. He found himself in the mountains, in a village where time moved slowly and the air was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke. The people spoke in soft voices, their eyes unhurried, their movements deliberate. There was no urgency here, no performance, just life unfolding in its natural pace. He rented a small room in a quiet home at the edge of the village, where the wind sang through the windows at night and the stars seemed close enough to touch. The first few days were difficult. His body was still wired for urgency. His mind resisted the stillness. He would wake in the middle of the night, gripped by the fear that he was wasting time, that he had made a mistake, that everything would collapse without his constant effort. But slowly, gently, the rhythm of the village began to settle inside him. He started to walk each morning, not to get anywhere, but simply to be. He would stop beside the stream, listening to its endless movement, and something in him would soften. He began to notice things he had long forgotten to see: the way light moves across stone, the pattern of leaves as they fall, the quiet dignity of a tree standing alone. Each evening, he would return to his room and sit by the window, notebook in hand, not to write answers, but to ask questions. Who am I when I am not being useful? What remains when the performance ends? Can I be loved if I am simply still? It was on one of those walks that he met the old monk. He was tending a small shrine near the edge of the woods, arranging stones and lighting incense, with hands that moved as if time bowed to them. The man watched him for a long moment, then approached with hesitation. The monk looked up and smiled, not a forced, polite smile, but one that seemed to come from a place so deep it had no beginning. "You've been walking a long time," the monk said softly, as if he were reading the man's bones rather than his face. The man nodded. "I don't know what I'm looking for," he admitted. The monk set down the incense and gestured to a stone bench beside the shrine. "Then you are ready to find it." They sat together in silence, the air filled with the scent of cedar and the faint rustle of leaves. The monk didn't ask questions. He didn't offer advice. He simply sat, fully present, as if his being there was answer enough. And for the first time in a long while, the man didn't feel the need to explain himself. He didn't feel broken. He didn't feel judged. He felt seen. Over the weeks that followed, they met often. Sometimes they walked together. Sometimes they shared tea beneath the wide branches of an old tree. Sometimes they said nothing for hours, And in those silences, more healing happened than in a lifetime of words. The monk never told the man what to do. Instead, he invited him to notice, to pay attention, to sit with the discomfort instead of fixing it, to breathe when the fear crept in, to ask his pain what it wanted to teach him. And slowly the man began to change, not by effort, but by presence. He started rising with the sun, watching the sky change colors as birds woke the world. He began to eat slowly, savoring each bite as if it were sacred. He started to cry, not from sadness, but from the relief of finally being allowed to feel. And each time he cried, the monk would sit with him, silent, patient, unafraid.